You're listening to English with Monty, the podcast about the English language. Today is 8-Minute English, talking about articles. Hello, this is 8-Minute English with Monty, and we're going to be talking about articles. Following on from the part 1 episode that we did, looking at things in a bit more detail, just to quickly review what happened in part 1. So we use a or an to mention somebody or something for the first time, or we say what somebody or something is. For example, you could say, I saw a dog with a man walking down the street. You could also say, I am a teacher, or that is a big house. So that's using a or an. Obviously use an with vowels, and also you could use it with silent H sounds, or also with the sound. For example, you would say a uniform, which is a U sound, whereas you would say an umbrella. Or also a hotel or an honest man. So we don't use an article to speak in general with plural and uncountable nouns, or in certain phrases using at home, work, to go home, to go to bed, and using next or last week, those kind of things. I would like to also talk about uncountable nouns, so nouns that are difficult or impossible to count. For example, information or air or liquids, for example, milk or wine. There is a common error that I find students making, which, for example, somebody would say, please give me a water. So water is an uncountable noun and should not be used with an indefinite article. So it should be, please give me some water. However, if you describe the water in terms of countable units like bottles, for example, you can use the indefinite article. Please give me a bottle of water. But if you're talking about ice, you wouldn't say, please give me an ice. You would say, please give me an ice cube, or please give me some ice. And also it depends on the context. So some nouns can be countable or uncountable. For example, you've got time, noise, light, or hair. So we need a light in this room. We need some light in this room. There is a noise outside, and I am making a noise. So let's move on to a few extra things to do with articles. For example, if you're talking about institutions, and when I say institutions, I mean things like hospital, university, school, church, and prison. You could use an example saying, my brother's in hospital. In this case, you don't use the article. My friend is in university or at university, so there you do not use the article. But if you are talking about the building, for example, if you're talking about a hospital building, you could say they are building a new hospital in my area. In that case, you do use an article because you're talking about the building rather than the institution itself. Then moving on, I suppose the next big thing is talking about things like acronyms. An acronym is when you use letters as an abbreviation for the full name. So for example, the UK is the United Kingdom. The USA is the United States of America. So if you are using acronyms, I would say almost 100% of the time you would use the. So you could also use it with the EU, the UN. There is one institution that I've noticed that you don't use it on, and that would be NATO. I'm not really sure why. I guess in some cases there are exceptions, so this seems to be an exception in this case. But otherwise, ordinarily, you would use it with an acronym. Coming on to countries, as we've already talked about the UK and the USA, if you're talking about a country on its own, for example, Tunisia, you would say Tunisia. You don't say the Tunisia. And then if you're talking about geographical locations, so you would say Tunisia is in North Africa. Again, you don't say the North Africa. Anytime you're talking about its geographical position, then again, you don't use the. For example, the UK is in North Europe. Just some other examples with countries. So for example, you would also say the Netherlands. I guess in this case, it would be talking about a group of areas that are brought together. So I think that's the reason why we say that. Also the Czech Republic. Anytime you've got a republic in the title, then you would use it. So you could say France, or you could say the Republic of France, depending on what you wanted to say. Coming on to the next one, you've got roads, streets, parks, shops, and restaurants. In this case, you're not using the article at all. For example, you could say Selfridges, one of London's biggest department stores, is on Oxford Street. So again, Oxford Street, you're not using the or with Selfridges, you don't use that either. There are a couple of exceptions in terms of road. So if you're talking about motorways or numbered roads, for example, in the UK, we would say the M1 or we could say the A3. So in those two cases, we do use the article. Moving on, again with geographical features, when you talk about individual mountains, so you would say, for example, Mount Snowdon, which is based in Wales. But if you're talking about a range of mountains, for example, the Alps, then you would always use the. Individual mountain, no article. Group of mountains, you need an article. Then if you talk about lakes, so Lake Victoria or Lake Windermere, in that case you don't use an article either, but you tend to use it if you're talking about a particular area, so you would say the Lake District, which is in northwest England. We've covered mountain ranges using the. Also with rivers we would use the Thames, seas, the Atlantic, canals, the Great Union Canal, deserts, so the Sahara, and also island groups, so the Maldives. Also names of theatres, you tend to use it, the Adelphi Theatre in London, or cinemas, hotels, galleries, and museums. I guess there are exceptions here, so it's not completely 100% that you would use them, but typically, yes. For example, the National Gallery and the British Museum are London tourist attractions. So in this case, yes, you would use the. The other thing I find a little bit tricky is maybe talking about buildings. Buildings, I would say most of the time you do not use an article, but it depends really. Again, there are exceptions. So you've got Buckingham Palace. There is no article there because it's a well-known building. If you're talking about a building that is not so well known, for example, the Shard, which was the largest building in London, if not Europe at the time. And we would call it the Shard. Nowadays, people are starting to call it Shard rather than the Shard. It could be that it changes over time as it becomes more recognized as a building. I think often this is quite a tricky one. Just be careful on this one, because in London as well, we would say the Gherkin. We don't normally say gherkin. Just look out for these different things and don't worry if there are those exceptions. There will always be a few exceptions. Most of these rules that I've given you don't have too many exceptions. Just take a look. Think about it when you're actually looking at particular words. Think about which grouping you would put it in. And also think about trying to translate from your own language. Sometimes it will directly translate, other times it will not. So if it doesn't, just think about when it doesn't. And if it does, great, do it. You've been listening to 8 Minute English with Monty. Thanks for joining me.